The sound was less a knock and more a frantic scratching at his door, a sound like a panicked bird trapped in a chimney. Jedediah Stone, a man who had grown to prefer the company of pines to people, lowered his half-empty coffee cup. The fire crackled, the only other sound in the vast silence of his mountain cabin. No one came up this high, not since Martha and little Samuel had been laid to rest in the valley below. He pulled his old Colt from its peg by the hearth, its weight of familiar and grim comfort in his hand. He moved to the door, his steps silent on the floorboards he'd laid himself. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice a low growl rough from disuse. A sob answered him, thin and desperate. "Please, please, you have to help me." It was the voice of a girl, young and terrified. Jed's brow furrowed. He slid the heavy bolt, a bar of iron he'd forged himself, and opened the door a crack. A sliver of a face, pale in the twilight, stared back at him. She was of Chinese descent, her features delicate but streaked with dirt and tears, her dark hair a tangled mess. She couldn't have been more than 18. "What do you want?" Jed asked, keeping his body between her and the warmth of his home. Her words came in a torrent, a desperate plea that tumbled over itself. "They're hurting her. The settlers in the town. They're beating my mom. They say she doesn't belong." The girl's eyes, wide and dark, fixed on his. "They're beating my mom for being Chinese," she repeated, her voice cracking with the unbearable weight of the words. She took a half-step forward, her small hands clasped together as if in prayer. She came to the mountain man and said, "Please, save her." Jedediah's heart, a thing he thought had turned to stone years ago, gave a painful lurch. He was the mountain man, the recluse. The stories they told about him in the valley were half-truths and full-on lies, all designed to keep people away. But this girl, she hadn't come because she was scared of the legend. She had come because she was more scared of the truth. He looked past her down the steep path that led to the valley, to the settlement of Redemption's Fork. He could see the faint glow of its lamps, a place he hadn't set foot in for 3 years, a place full of memories and ghosts. "Well, me?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The law in Redemption's Fork was a man named Sheriff Blackwood, a man who valued order over justice and gold over both. "Because they say you answer to no one," she whispered. "They say you're a hard man, but a fair one." Jedediah looked at her torn dress, the scratches on her arms from her desperate flight through the wilderness. He saw the ghost of his own daughter's face in her terror, the ghost of his wife's in her plea for family. The world he had tried so desperately to shut out was scratching at his door again, demanding he be a man, not just a memory. He let out a long, slow breath, the cold mountain air stinging his lungs. He opened the door wider. "Get inside," he said, his voice flat. "Tell me everything." Her name was Maylene. She huddled by the fire, wrapped in one of Martha's old woolen blankets, sipping the hot, sweet coffee Jed had given her. The warmth was slowly chasing the tremor from her limbs, but her eyes still held the terror of the things she had seen. Her mother, Annui, was a healer, a woman who used herbs and ancient knowledge to mend what the town's clumsy doctor often made worse. They had come from across the great ocean, following the dream of a new life, only to find the same old hatreds in a new land. They'd kept to themselves, running a small laundry and tending to their garden, but a sickness had swept through the settlement, and when Dr. Miller's remedies failed, some had turned to Annui. Her success had bred resentment, and that resentment, fanned by the winds of ignorance, had turned to violence. "It's Silas Croft and his boys," Maylene said, her voice barely a whisper. "He owns the freight company. He says we're an infestation, a yellow peril. Today, he claimed my mother's herbs, poisoned his prize horse." It was a lie. Everyone knew the horse was old and sick. Jed listened, his face an unreadable mask of granite. He cleaned his rifle with slow, deliberate movements, the scent of gun oil filling the small cabin. Each word she spoke was another nail being hammered into the coffin of his solitude. "They dragged her from our shop," Maylene continued, a fresh wave of tears rolling down her cheeks. "They took her to the town square. Silas was hitting her with a harness strap. No one stopped him. Not Sheriff Blackwood, no one. She had slipped out the back, running without stopping, her only thought to find the one man in the territory who didn't bow to men like Croft or Blackwood, the mountain man, the widower whose grief was said to be as vast and as cold as the peaks he lived on. Jed finished with the rifle and stood it by the door. He strapped on his gun belt, the leather creaking in the quiet room. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His actions spoke a language of grim intent. "Where are you going?" Maylene asked, her eyes wide. "To get your mother," he said simply. He pulled on a heavy sheepskin coat and took a lantern from the mantel. His gaze met hers, and for the first time she saw something flicker in the depths of his gray eyes. It wasn't pity. It was something harder, something forged in a fire she couldn't possibly understand. It was resolve. "They'll kill you," she breathed. "Jedediah said." He paused at the door, his large frame filling the opening. "Bolt this behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me, understand?" She nodded, clutching the blanket tighter. He gave a curt nod in return and stepped out into the night, the darkness swallowing him whole, leaving Maylene alone with the crackling fire and the terrifying, fragile flicker of hope. The descent into Redemption's Fork was a journey through Jedediah's own past. Every twist in the path, every familiar silhouette of a rock or a twisted juniper carried a memory of Martha. He pushed them down, burying them under the cold weight of his purpose. Grief was a luxury, and tonight he couldn't afford it. He didn't ride into town on the main road. He left his horse tethered in a grove of aspens and moved like a ghost through the timberline that bordered the settlement. The town was a raw scar of mud and crude lumber carved into the valley. Lamplight spilled from the saloon, along with the raucous sounds of tinny piano music and coarse laughter. The town square was mostly deserted, but the evidence of the day's cruelty was there. A dropped basket, its contents of herbs and roots scattered and trampled in the dirt. A dark stain on the ground near the public well. Jed's jaw tightened. He knew Silas Croft, a loud, belligerent man who mistook his wealth for worth and his cruelty for strength. His warehouse was at the far end of the street, a large, squat building where he housed his freight wagons. A single lantern burned in the office window. Jed didn't go to the door. He moved around to the back, to the loading bay. As he got closer, he could hear a low moan of pain. He drew the Colt, its hammer clicking back with a sound that was unnaturally loud in the still night air. He peered through a grimy window, and Yee was there, slumped against a stack of crates. Her face was bruised and swollen, her traditional silk tunic torn. Two of Croft's hired thugs stood guard, sharing a bottle of whiskey and laughing. Silas Croft himself was nowhere to be seen. Jed didn't waste time on a plan. Plans got people killed. He kicked the side door in, the wood splintering with a deafening crack. The two men scrambled for their guns, their drunken reflexes slow. They weren't slow enough to be stupid, but they were far too slow for a man who had survived the war between the states. Jed's first shot took one man in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second shot was not a warning, it was a statement. It punched a hole in the whiskey bottle the other man was holding, showering him in glass and cheap liquor. "Drop 'em," Jed commanded, his voice a low thunder that seemed to shake the very rafters. The second man, wide-eyed and soaked, let his pistol clatter to the floor. The first was groaning, clutching his bleeding arm. Jed ignored them. He walked over to Nyu, who looked up at him with eyes that held no fear, only a profound weariness. She was a small, delicate woman, but there was an unbreakable strength in her gaze. "Maylene sent me," Jed said softly. He holstered his pistol and carefully helped her to her feet. She was hurt, but her bones seemed intact. She leaned heavily on him, her breathing shallow. "You are the mountain man," she whispered, her voice raspy. "No, I am," he confirmed. "Let's get you home." He walked her out the way he came, leaving the two thugs to their misery. As they stepped into the cold night, the saloon doors swung open and Silas Croft stumbled out, his face flushed with drink. His eyes landed on Jed and the woman he was supporting. Croft's face twisted into a mask of pure rage. "Stone, what in the hell do you think you're doing with my property?" Jed didn't stop walking. "She's not your property, Silas. She's a menace. And you're interfering," Croft roared, reaching for the pistol on his hip. "Blackwood will hear about this." Jed stopped. He turned slowly, shielding Nyu with his body. He looked at Silas Croft, his eyes as cold and unforgiving as a winter grave. "You tell Sheriff Blackwood that Jedediah Stone has taken these women under his protection. You tell him if he wants them, he can come up the mountain and get them." He turned and continued walking, disappearing with Nyu into the darkness before Croft could form a reply. The freight baron stood there, sputtering in impotent rage, the threat echoing in the silent street. The climb back up the mountain was slow and arduous. and Iwayu was weak, and Jedediah all but carried her the last half-mile. The light of his cabin was a welcome beacon in the oppressive darkness. As they approached, the door creaked open, and Maylene stood there, her face a pale oval of anxiety. Relief washed over her features as she saw her mother, and she rushed forward, helping Jed guide the injured woman inside. They settled her into Jed's own bed, the only one in the cabin. Maylene immediately began to tend to her mother's wounds, her movements deft and sure, a skill clearly passed down. Jed stood back, watching the quiet, practiced intimacy between mother and daughter. It was a scene of such powerful love and care that it ached in his chest, a phantom limb of a life he had lost. He stoked the fire, putting more logs on to ward off the deep chill of the night and of the trouble he had just invited into his home. He had crossed the line. For 3 years he had maintained a fragile peace built on isolation. He was the ghost on the mountain, a man best left alone. Now, he had kicked in a door, shot a man, and openly defied the most powerful man in the valley. He had declared war, and his home was now the battlefield. He looked around the one-room cabin he had built with his own hands for Martha. Her rocking chair was still by the hearth. Samuel's small carved wooden horse sat on the mantelpiece. This place was not just a shelter, it was a shrine to his grief, a fortress against the world, and he had just lowered the drawbridge. Maylene finished tending to her mother, who had drifted into an exhausted sleep. She turned to Jed, her dark eyes shining with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It was more than gratitude. It was a kind of awe. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but full of feeling. "No other man would have done this." "Most men have more to lose," Jed replied gruffly, staring into the flames. "You have this," she said, her gesture taking in the whole cabin. "Your home, your peace. You risked it all for strangers. You weren't strangers the moment you came to my door asking for help," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. It was a creed he'd learned from his father, a creed he thought he'd buried with his family. A man protects those who cannot protect themselves. It was as simple and as complicated as that. He walked to the door and slid the heavy iron bolt back into place. The sound was definitive. It was the sound of a choice made, a gauntlet thrown. He had shut the world out to protect his heart. Now, he was shutting the world out to protect them. He had made his choice, a decision that would bring danger to his door. As he closes that door, we hope you're enjoying this story of courage. If you are, taking a moment to like the video helps us bring more tales like this to you. Now, with the latch thrown, the real challenge began. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended quiet. The mountain was wrapped in a thick fog, isolating the cabin completely, as if nature itself was offering them a temporary shield. Inside, a new rhythm took hold. Nwaye, though still weak, directed Maylene from the bed, pointing out which of Jed's stored herbs could be used to make poultices and teas for her recovery. Jed found himself an observer in his own home. He watched as Maylene moved about the cabin, her quiet efficiency a stark contrast to his own lumbering presence. She cooked, using his meager supplies to create meals that were surprisingly flavorful. She mended his worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She brought a sense of life to the dusty, silent corners of the cabin, a life he had long since extinguished. He kept his distance, speaking only when necessary. He would spend his days outside, chopping wood with a fierce, almost punishing intensity, or patrolling the perimeter of his land, his rifle a permanent extension of his arm. He was looking for signs of Croft or Blackwood, but the fog and the mountain kept his secrets. One afternoon he returned to the cabin to find Maylene humming a soft, unfamiliar melody as she kneaded dough on his small wooden table. The smell of baking bread filled the air, a scent he hadn't experienced in years. It was Martha's scent. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow, and he stopped dead in the doorway. Maylene looked up, her humming ceased. She saw the look on his face, the raw pain that flickered in his eyes before he could hide it. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I should have asked." Jed shook his head, unable to speak for a moment. He cleared his throat. "It's fine," he managed to say, his voice tight. "It's just been a while." And Yui spoke from the bed, her voice gaining strength each day. "A home needs the song of a woman and the smell of bread, mountain man. It is the only way to keep the ghosts from getting too comfortable." Her words were wise and cut straight to the bone. Jed looked at her, then at Maylene. He saw that they weren't just taking shelter here. They were trying to heal the space itself. They were trying to heal him. Later that evening, after they had eaten the fresh bread in a comfortable silence, Maylene approached him as he stood by the window, staring out into the gray mist. "My mother wanted me to give you this," she said, holding out a small ceramic pot. He took it. It was a salve, cool and fragrant with pine and other herbs he didn't recognize. "What is it for?" "Your hands," she said, nodding toward them. He looked down and saw that they were raw and blistered from the axe. He hadn't even noticed. "And for the soul," she added softly. "So my mother says." He looked from the pot to her face. Her gaze was direct, unafraid. He was used to people flinching from him, from the hardness he projected. She did not. She looked at him and saw the man, not the mountain. A fragile tendril of warmth unfurled in his chest, a feeling so alien he almost recoiled from it. It was the beginning of trust, a dangerous and beautiful thing. The fog lifted on the 5th day, revealing the valley below in sharp, unforgiving detail. It was like a curtain rising on the second act of a play. Jed knew their borrowed time was over. He was on his porch, sharpening an axe blade, when he saw the riders, 3 of them, making their way slowly up the winding path to his cabin. He didn't need to see them clearly to know who they were. One was large and rode with an arrogant slump, Silas Croft. The one with the glint of a star on his chest would be Sheriff Blackwood. The third was likely a deputy. Jed laid the axe aside and picked up his rifle, leaning it against the cabin wall by the door. He didn't want to greet them with it in his hands. That was an escalation, but he wanted it close. He sat down in his rocking chair, his face calm, betraying none of the tension coiling in his gut. Balian came to the doorway behind him. "Who is it?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "The law," Jed said without turning, "and the man who thinks he is. Get your mother. Stay in the back of the cabin, away from the window." She hesitated. "Jedediah." He turned his head then, his gaze meeting hers. "Do as I say, Maylene." His tone was firm, but not unkind. She nodded and disappeared back inside. The 3 riders came to a stop a dozen yards from his porch. Sheriff Blackwood was a man who looked like he'd been poured into his uniform and had since expanded. His face was fleshy and perpetually florid. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, designed to project an authority he didn't rightfully possess. "Stone," Blackwood said, his voice oily. "We need to have a talk." "I'm listening," Jed replied, his hands resting on his knees. "Silas here tells me you absconded with his property a few nights ago, caused a bit of a ruckus down at his warehouse, discharged a firearm within town limits, assaulted 2 of his employees." Blackwood ticked the imaginary charges off on his fingers. "That's a whole mess of trouble. The woman was injured. I rendered aid," Jed said, his voice flat. "You call that aid?" Croft snarled from his horse. "You stole my indentured servant. That Chinnawoman and her girl owe me 2 years of service to pay for their passage." It was a lie, and they all knew it, but in a town like Redemption's Fork, a lie from a man like Croft was as good as the truth. Jed's eyes never left the sheriff's. "They're not servants, and they're not going with you," Jed said. Blackwood sighed, a theatrical display of a patient man pushed to his limit. "Now, Jed, be reasonable. We can't have folks just taking things that ain't theirs. It's bad for business. It upsets the natural order. Just give us the women, and I'll forget all about the other charges, for old time's sake." Jedediah's knuckles whitened. "The only natural order I recognize is the one that says a man protects his own. They're on my land. That makes them my own." The sheriff's folksy demeanor vanished, replaced by a cold hardness. "This is your last chance, Stone. Don't make me come back here with a posse. There's a lot of folks in town who agree with Mr. Croft's position. They'll be more than happy to help me drag those women down from this mountain and burn this shack to the ground while we're at it." It was a direct threat, a promise of mob violence sanctioned by the law. The stakes had just been raised from a personal dispute to a war against the town itself. Jed stood up slowly. He was a big man, and his shadow fell long across the porch. "You come back up here, Sheriff," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You make sure you bring enough men to carry you back down." Blackwood's face purpled. He stared at Jed for a long moment, then turned without another word, climbed onto his horse and rode away, Croft and the deputy trailing behind him. The threat hung in the air, heavy and poisonous as smoke. After the sheriff left, a heavy silence descended upon the cabin, thicker and more menacing than the fog had ever been. Maylene emerged from the back room, her face pale, and Y.A. followed, leaning on the doorframe, her expression grim. "You should not have done that," Manu said, her voice steady despite her frailty. "You have made an enemy of the whole town for us." "You came to me for help," Jed replied, turning to face them. "I gave my word. A man's word is all he has on this mountain." "A man's life is also all he has," she countered gently. "We are not worth your life, Jedediah Stone." He looked at the two of them, a mother and daughter who had lost everything but each other. He saw their resilience, their quiet dignity in the face of unspeakable hatred, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that they were wrong. "You are," he said. The two words were simple, but they held the weight of his conviction. He was no longer just a man hiding from his ghosts. He was a man with a purpose. He was a protector. That night, the work began. Jed was no fool. He knew Blackwood's threat was not an idle one. He began to fortify the cabin, turning it from a home into a makeshift fortress. He barred the windows with heavy wooden shutters he'd built for winter storms. He checked his supply of ammunition, laying out the cartridges on the table, a grim tally of his chances. Maylene watched him, her fear warring with a growing admiration. This was not a brawler or a thug. This was a man preparing for a siege with a methodical, deadly calm. He explained to her how to reload the spare rifle, his large, calloused hands guiding her smaller ones, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You stay with your mother," he instructed, "but if they get inside, you need to know how to use this. You aim for the center of the chest. You don't hesitate." She nodded, her throat tight. The cold, hard reality of their situation was settling in. This was not a nightmare from which she would awaken. This was their life now. As they worked, a new dynamic formed between them. The polite distance was replaced by the easy familiarity of soldiers preparing for battle. She would bring him a cup of coffee without asking. He would point out a loose floorboard she needed to avoid. Small gestures of care in the shadow of impending violence. One evening, as he was inspecting the heavy bar on the door, she came to stand beside him. "You were a soldier, weren't you?" she asked quietly. He nodded, not looking at her. "A long time ago. Is that where you learned all this?" "I learned how to fight," he said, his voice low. "But I learned more about what happens when good men do nothing. I won't make that mistake again." In that moment, she understood him. The grief that had hollowed him out had also forged him into something unbreakable. He wasn't protecting them out of pity. He was protecting them because his very soul demanded it. It was his penance, his redemption. And as she looked at the grim set of his jaw, she realized with a start that she was no longer just afraid for her life. She was afraid for his. 2 days passed. The tension was a living thing in the cabin, a fourth resident with a cold and constant presence. Every snap of a twig outside, every hoot of an owl sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. Sleep came in brief, fitful bursts. During this time, Ann Wayu, now able to move about the cabin more freely, began to assert her quiet strength. She seemed to have no fear, only a deep, abiding calm that was its own form of defiance. She would sit in Martha's rocking chair, mending their clothes, and tell stories of her homeland, of wise empresses and cunning dragons. The stories were for Maylene, but Jed found himself listening, drawn to the ancient rhythms of her voice. One afternoon she called him over. "Show me your hands," she commanded gently. He obeyed without question. She took his large, scarred hands in her small, delicate ones and examined them. She traced the lines and calluses, the map of a hard life etched into his skin. "These are good hands," she said. "They have known work and sorrow. They know how to build and how to protect." She looked up, her dark, knowing eyes meeting his. "A man's hands tell the story his mouth will not. Your story is one of great loss, but it is not over. The last chapter has not yet been written." Jed felt a lump form in his throat. This woman, whom he had rescued, was seeing through the walls he had spent years building, right into the broken rooms of his heart. He pulled his hands back, uncomfortable with the intimacy of her perception. Later, as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, he was outside, making a final check of the perimeter. Maylene brought him a bowl of stew. They stood in silence for a while, watching the last of the light fade behind the peaks. "My father was a scholar," she said suddenly, her voice soft in the growing twilight. "He believed that a single act of courage could change the course of a river. He said that honor was not about never falling, but about rising every time you fall." Jed listened, his gaze fixed on the valley below, where the lights of Redemption's Fork were beginning to twinkle with deceptive warmth. "He was killed for refusing to bow to a corrupt official," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "My mother and I, we fled. We came here looking for a new life." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "It seems we found the same men, just with different faces." She looked at him then, her expression a mixture of sorrow and strength. "You are like my father, Jedediah. You do not bow." Her words settled over him, a greater burden and a greater honor than he had ever known. He was being compared to a man he'd never met, a scholar, a man of courage. He, the broken soldier, the grieving husband who had run from the world. In the eyes of this young woman, he was something more. He was something worthy. It was in that moment, as darkness finally fell, that the bond between them solidified. It was no longer just about a debt of rescue or an obligation of honor. It was a connection forged in shared peril, a deep and unspoken understanding. He was her protector, and she, in her own way, was his. She was the one who saw the man he could be, not just the man he had been. The attack did not come with a warning. There was no shout, no demand for surrender. There was only the sudden, sharp crack of a rifle shot from the tree line, and the splintering of wood as a bullet slammed into the doorframe, inches from Jed's head. He reacted instantly, shoving Maylene away from the door and down to the floor. "Get down!" he roared, grabbing his own rifle. Another shot punched through the window, shattering the glass and showering the floor with glittering shards. "Envoyeur! The back room!" Maylene cried, scrambling on her hands and knees toward her mother. Jed peered through a crack in the shutters. He could see them now, at least a dozen men, using the trees and rocks for cover, slowly advancing on the cabin. It wasn't an official posse. It was a mob. He could see Silas Croft, his face contorted in a hateful sneer, directing them. "They mean to kill us all," Maylene said from the floor, her voice trembling but her eyes fixed on the spare rifle Jed had given her. "They'll try," Jed said, his voice grim. He raised his rifle, sighted on a man who was breaking cover, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, and the man in the clearing cried out and fell, clutching his leg. A volley of shots answered him, peppering the front of the cabin with lead, the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and splintered pine. "You say that from experience?" Jed muttered, reloading with practiced efficiency. "They don't know this mountain. This is my home." He moved from window to window, a ghost in the dim light of the cabin, firing sparingly, making every shot count. He wasn't trying to kill them, not yet. He was trying to wound them, to break their nerve. A wounded man screamed, and his friends had to risk themselves to help him. A dead man was just quiet. For what felt like an eternity, the battle raged. The men outside were fueled by whiskey and hatred, but they were not soldiers. They were farmers and freight hands, and their courage began to waver against the determined, deadly accurate fire coming from the lone cabin. Inside, Maylene had found her own courage. While Jed fought, she helped her mother to the root cellar, the safest place in the house. Then she took up the spare rifle, her hands shaken but her resolve firm. She knelt by the side window just as Jed had shown her and waited. Silas Croft, enraged that his mob was being held at bay by one man, grew reckless. He and two others decided to rush the porch. "They're coming," Jed yelled, firing at one and sending him sprawling. But Croft and the other man were too close. They hit the door with their combined weight, and the heavy bar groaned in protest. Jed knew the bar wouldn't hold against a second blow. He braced himself, ready to meet them as they came through, but before they could hit the door again, the sound of a second rifle shot cracked from inside the cabin. Jed looked over in astonishment. Maylene was at the side window, the rifle to her shoulder, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. Outside, the man next to Croft screamed and dropped, his shoulder shattered. "Shout," and followed back, the second shot asked. His friend had tried to concuss at Wayne. Croft, his face a mask of shock and fury, stared first at his fallen man, then at the window where Maylene knelt. He was exposed, his charge broken. He looked up and met Jedediah's cold, hard gaze through the main window. Fear finally broke through his rage. He turned and fled, crashing back into the woods, his remaining men scrambling after him. Silence fell, broken only by the groans of the wounded men they had left behind. The first wave was over. In the aftermath of the failed assault, the cabin was a wreck of shattered glass, splintered wood, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Jed stood in the middle of it all, his rifle held loosely in his hands, his ears ringing. Maylene was still at the window, staring at the spot where the man she had shot had fallen. Her face was ashen, her knuckles white where she gripped the rifle stock. She had not hesitated. She had done what needed to be done, but the cost was etched on her face. Jed walked over and gently took the rifle from her hands. "You did good," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "You saved my life." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock. "I shot a man." "You stopped a man who was trying to kill us," he corrected her. He looked out at the groaning figures in his yard. "They'll be back, and Croft will bring Blackwood with him next time. They won't stop until this is finished." Nueyu emerged from the cellar, her face calm. She went to her daughter, putting a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You have a warrior's spirit, my daughter, like the women of our line." She then looked at Jed. "They will try to burn us out." Jed nodded. "It's what I would do." He knew they couldn't stay in the cabin. It was a death trap now, but he wasn't going to run. This was his land, his mountain, and he would make his stand here. "There's a place," he said, his mind working quickly. "An old prospector's tunnel, up in the rocks behind the cabin. It's narrow, easy to defend. We can take supplies, make our stand there." There was no time to waste. As the sun began to set, they gathered what they could: water, food, blankets, and every last cartridge Jed possessed. He helped the wounded men outside onto their horses, giving them a slap on the rump to send them back toward town. It wasn't mercy, it was a message. A message that he was still in control. Under the cover of darkness, he'd led the two women out the back of the cabin and up a steep, narrow trail into the granite cliffs that overlooked his small homestead. The entrance to the tunnel was hidden behind a thicket of overgrown brush, a dark slash in the rock face. "It's not much," he said, lighting a lantern, "but they can only come at us one at a time." They made a small, defensible camp deep inside the tunnel. From the entrance, they had a perfect view of the cabin below. They were no longer the hunted waiting in a trap. They were the hunters waiting in an ambush. "Now we wait," Jed said, taking up his position near the mouth of the cave, his rifle resting on a rock ledge. The final confrontation was coming. He could feel it in the cold night air. But this time, it would be on his terms, on his mountain, in his mouth. The night was long and cold. They took turns on watch, but no one truly slept. The silence was more unnerving than the chaos of the gunfight. It was a silence filled with anticipation, with the knowledge that morning would bring the end. In the pre-dawn gloom, Maylene came to sit beside Jed at the mouth of the tunnel. She handed him a piece of dried meat and a canteen of water. They ate in silence, watching the stars fade as the eastern sky began to blush with the first hints of gray light. "I'm scared, Jedediah," she confessed, her voice a near whisper. "Being scared is what keeps you alive," he replied, not taking his eyes off the cabin below. "It's letting the fear control you that gets you killed. You're not afraid, are you?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I was afraid for a long time," he said finally, his voice raspy with memory. "When I lost my wife and son to the fever, I was afraid of the silence, afraid of the memories, afraid of feeling anything at all. That's why I came up here, to hide from it." He turned to look at her, his eyes clear and steady in the dim light. "I'm not afraid anymore. You and your mother, you brought this fight to my door, but you also brought life back into my house. You gave me something to protect again. A man with nothing to protect is already dead. He just hasn't stopped breathing yet." Her heart swelled at his words. In the face of death, he had given her the most profound gift of all, the truth of his own rebirth. She reached out and her hand covered his on the cold stock of his rifle. A silent promise passed between them. Whatever came, they would face it together. As the sun crested the peaks, they saw them. A large group this time, at least 20 men led by Sheriff Blackwood and Silas Croft. They rode with a grim purpose, armed not just with rifles, but with torches. They surrounded the cabin, their caution from the day before replaced with mob arrogance. Blackwood hailed the cabin, his voice echoing in the clear morning air. "Stone, this is your last chance. Send out the women." When he received no answer, he gave a curt nod to Croft. On his signal, several men ran forward and threw their torches onto the roof of the cabin. The dry shingles caught immediately, and hungry orange flames began to lick at the eaves. Jed watched his home burn, the place where he had loved and lost, the shrine to his past, being consumed by the hatred of ignorant men. But he felt no sorrow, only a cold and clarifying rage. That cabin was a tomb. His life was here, now, in this cave, with these women. "They think we're in there," Maylene whispered. "Let 'em," Jed said. He raised his rifle. "They're about to learn a lesson about this mountain." As the fire grew, the mob grew bolder, laughing and congratulating each other. They had gathered in a knot to watch the cabin burn, their backs to the cliffs, their backs to him. It was a fatal mistake. Jed took a steadying breath, aimed and fired. The first shot was a declaration of war. It came from an impossible direction, from the heavens themselves, it seemed. One of the men standing next to Silas Croft dropped to the ground, a clean shot through his shoulder. Chaos erupted. The mob scattered, firing wildly into the trees, into the sky, anywhere but the right place. Jed fired again and a second man fell. They couldn't see him. They were firing at a ghost, and the mountain itself seemed to be fighting against them. "It's a trick," Blackwood bellowed, trying to regain control. "He's in the rocks, find him." But his men were terrified. They were being picked off one by an unseen enemy. This wasn't a fight, it was a slaughter. Croft, his face a mask of terror and rage, finally spotted the small puff of smoke from the cave entrance. "There!" he screamed, pointing. "He's in the cave!" He and Blackwood, along with a handful of their most loyal men, broke from cover and charged toward the cliffs. It was what Jed had been waiting for. They were coming into his kill zone. A narrow, exposed stretch of rock and scree. "Alien, stay back," he commanded, his focus absolute. He worked the rifle with a calm, deadly rhythm. He was no longer a man. He was an instrument of justice. Each shot was deliberate, aimed not to kill but to incapacitate. A man in the leg, a man in the arm. He was systematically dismantling their assault. Blackwood and Croft were the only ones left, scrambling up the rocks toward the tunnel. Blackwood was firing his pistol wildly, the shots ricocheting harmlessly off the granite walls. Croft was right behind him, his face contorted in a primal scream of hatred. Jed's rifle clicked empty. He dropped it and drew his Colt just as Blackwood reached the ledge before the cave. The sheriff leveled his pistol, his face triumphant. "It's over, Stone." Jed fired. His single shot was true. The pistol flew from Blackwood's hand, and the sheriff howled in pain, clutching his shattered wrist. Before Jed could turn his attention to Croft, the man lunged, not with a gun, but with a large hunting knife. He crashed into Jed, and the two men tumbled to the ground, wrestling for control of the blade. They were a whirlwind of desperate violence. Croft was younger and heavier, but Jed was stronger, his muscles forged by years of hard labor and hardship. He fought with the grim tenacity of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. He managed to get his hand around Croft's wrist, slowly, inexorably, turning the blade away from his own throat. With a final desperate heave, he twisted, and Croft cried out as his own momentum drove the knife into his side. The man's eyes went wide with shock, his grip slackened, and he collapsed. Jed scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily, and kicked the knife away. He stood over the two men who had brought this war to his home. Blackwood was cradling his hand, his face pale with shock. Croft was bleeding out onto the rocks, his reign of terror over. The rest of the mob had fled. He turned and looked back into the tunnel. Maylene was there, the spare rifle in her hands, ready to use it if she had to. NYU stood behind her, her face a mixture of fear and pride. He looked from their faces to the valley below, where his home was now a pyre of smoke and embers. It was all gone, and yet, for the first time in years, Jedediah Stone felt like he had everything. They didn't go back down to Redemption's Fork. There was nothing left for any of them there. With the fall of Croft and the disgrace of Blackwood, the town was left to find its own soul. Jedediah, Maylene, and NYU went deeper into the mountains. Using what was left of Jed's supplies and NYU's incredible knowledge of the land, they found a small hidden valley with a clear stream and fertile soil. Together, with their own hands, they built a new cabin. It was smaller than the first, but stronger. And it was not a tomb, it was a home. Life found a new rhythm, and UA planted a garden that thrived. Maylene learned the ways of the mountain, her laughter echoing in the pines. And Jedediah learned to live again. The ghosts of his past were not gone, but they were quiet now, joined by the gentle spirits of a new family. One evening, as the sun set, he and Maylene stood on their new porch, watching the colors bleed across the sky. Her hand found his, and their fingers intertwined. It was a simple gesture, but it held the promise of a future built not on what they had lost, but on what they had fought, together, to save. The mountain man was no longer alone. You've just witnessed a story of quiet strength and redemption. If this tale resonated with you, subscribe to our channel for more stories from the American West. Let us know your favorite moment in the comments below. Thank you for watching.